Welcome. How did you enjoy the clouds? I loved it. It may have been even funnier than the birds, but hard to say. Before we get started, make sure to follow us on our blog. And whenever you're buying books for the project, make sure you're using our Amazon affiliate link, which you'll be able to find in the description. So I would recommend, in this case, I wrote a very long essay about the clouds. And I do recommend that you read it. I mean, most of the content of it will be included in this video as well, but it's going to be a little bit more extensive in the writing and a little bit more polished. I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep that up for every book. Probably I'll have a less rigorous workflow moving forward. Maybe for some of the more major works, I will write long, detailed essays, but you could check this one out. I really got a kick out of this play. This was very different from the birds. It wasn't really very ethereal. It wasn't supernatural really, except for the clouds themselves. But it was very funny. I'm going to go through some of the major themes that I noticed and that I've written about, starting with the sedentary intellectual parasite, which is how Aristophanes basically characterizes the philosopher class of ancient Athens. So, from the very beginning, Aristophanes is taking shots at the Sophists, who are, this class of philosophers who are using rhetoric and their verbal prowess to do various things. And we see that our protagonist, he's in great debt, and he wants to use rhetorical skills like Socrates has and others have in order to basically scheme and trick his way out of having to pay back his debts. And he wants to send his son to go learn philosophy from Socrates, who runs the think shop down the street, basically. But when he won't go, our main character goes himself. And that's when we first see these sort of cutting descriptions of our philosophers, of Socrates and his students. When we walk into the think shop, the first thing we see is, first of all, it's totally in squalor. All the students are in rags. They are poor, they're starving, they're covered in fleas, and they're just going over inane, ridiculous concepts that they're just discussing among one another. So when we walk in, they're talking about how they figured out the size of a flea's foot by dipping the flea in candle wax and then taking it off, and they're figuring out which side of a gnat does it fart from, and things like that. And it makes me think of the famous "how many angels can fit on the head of a pin" argument from the Middle Ages, saying that you have this brilliant mind, and but you're spinning your gears, basically you're spinning your wheels to figure out things that are totally irrelevant. And particularly funny, you have the students. He comes into one room and the students are all they have their faces to the ground and they have their rear ends in the air, and they say that this is so that they can study geology and astronomy at the same time, which I laughed at quite a bit. And he's particularly clever, which is what he's known for, and he basically just paints this picture that these intellectuals are totally useless. They're studying useless things, and when they are doing something of note or doing something active, it's usually scheming or scamming. Like our main character, he wants to use rhetoric in order to get out of his debts, which Socrates seems to be more than willing to help him with, basically. Um, and why does Aristophanes, he really goes out of his way to portray these people in a nasty light. But if we think about the context of the time, we can kind of understand why. Aristophanes, from what we know, this play was performed at the end of the first of the three Peloponnesian Wars, or the first of the three phases of it, after the city was sieged and repeatedly attacked by Sparta, behind the walls of Athens and the skirt wall, and Pericles dies, and everybody gets plague and starves, basically. And, from his perspective, I think this is what he's portraying, he sees these philosophers, these sophists, as sedentary intellectual parasites, right? Just as the title of the theme is. They are, the men are sort of defending the city, and what are these? These are the best and brightest of Athens, presumably, and what are they doing with their minds? They're, whispering to each other esoteric nothings, and basically turning their back on tradition and on their duty. And you could see, Aristophanes as a nation-loving conservative, why he would feel aggrieved by that and why he would be unhappy with it. And it reminds me of kind of like the hippie movement in the Vietnam War in the United States, where you have this movement, this like spiritual or philosophical movement of people who are in the middle of a war. The young people are being drafted, and they have to fight on behalf of their society, and so they turn on, tune in, and drop out, right? Like Timothy Leary said. And so they're opting to kind of take on this nihilistic, or at least this philosophy that ridicules and makes their society look ridiculous, as a way of kind of shirking that duty, right? I think that's how Aristophanes saw it. He saw it as things are getting tough, and these young men, they're supposed to be our best and brightest. They should be leading at the front, and instead they're putting on a pauper's costume, and they're just hanging out and whatever, right? It also reminded me, and it's a very similar theme, it reminded me of kind of psychedelic escapism. Like, I remember there was this image that was floating around on the internet a while back. It wasn't psychedelic, it was actually like a VR thing, but the guy had the VR headset on, and he was smiling, and he's sitting in the corner, and he's emaciated, and he's living in a rundown apartment that's like empty with no furniture, and it's kind of like that. It's like a drug-induced or some sort of escapism-induced poverty. And this is a theme throughout the play, this idea that to have great wisdom, or maybe not wisdom, but to have great, because I would say that he specifies the division here, to have great wit and to have great rhetorical ability, you have to give up worldly possession. You have to become an ascetic, basically, and live like in filth. And I wouldn't say ascetic because they do show sexual depravity, but you have to be willing to give up sort of the finer trappings of citizenry. It's really about rejecting citizenship and the better parts of society in that regard. So, and we can relate to this very closely, I think, in our time. We're also in a crisis. You could say Athens was besieged and in distress, and it was kind of falling, the society was falling apart, and the empire was severed from its mother city. And then the people who were supposed to be responsible, the people who inherited the privilege of citizenship and were supposed to be defending the society, were basically turning on it. And they were, questioning their authority, and they were sort of ridiculing and mocking their traditions, whether religious or just in terms of the way that society was organized. And it's a type of betrayal. And, we come from an extension of essentially Athenian society as the seed of Western civilization. And we see that many of our brethren who should be like fighting by our side are actually just, and some of us have done this, I've done this in the past as well, they're kind of, the wool is pulled over their eyes, and they're like forced, or they're not forced, but they are sort of tricked into rejecting their heritage and kind of putting on the uniform of the enemy even, and so, hopefully that doesn't lead to our destruction the way it led to Athenian destruction, at least in Aristophanes' eyes, but we'll see. And that brings me to the second theme, which is Socrates in a new light. So I say, in the modern day, we are taught to see Socrates as a hero. He was someone who questioned authority and embarrassed the stodgy, calcified aristocrats and oligarchs of his time, whose rigid worldviews held back progress. And that is how we're taught. I mean, I took classes in college about Plato and his writing, and and just the general sort of feeling is kind of like, and it is like a very liberal sort of feeling that, Socrates, he was like a rebel, and he was good, and he, was questioning the man, and, he's kind of like painted as this sort of punk rock figure, which I guess he was. Maybe I'm just not a fan of that sort of mentality anymore. But in reality, he was quite subversive, we could say. Like I said, Athens was under siege, and Socrates, he's basically taking the youth of that time, the upper crust, because most of his followers were of aristocratic background, and he's teaching them, he's questioning, we see in the dialogues and the writings of Plato that he's embarrassing the commercial and religious and political leaders of Athens, and questioning the gods and things like that. And that is something that's kind of bad, right? Maybe in peacetime that would be one thing, but the city is in crisis, and Athens was destroyed because of this, and they had to go through 30 years of demagogues before even being able to put the democracy back in place, and they never really regained their former glory. So, I mean, there was a real cost, presumably, at least from people who are on Aristophanes' side, there was a real cost to this, a great cost to the motherland. Now, this is a good time for us to say that we're taking everything that I've been saying is taking Aristophanes' side. It's not even taking his side. I'm just kind of painting the picture that he's painting. I'm reflecting Aristophanes' perspective. He was very critical of the Sophists, but you'll see written a lot, that Socrates, like maybe the criticisms of the Sophists that he's positing, that they're sort of these sedentary intellectuals who are using their abilities to drain society, etc. And they're hypersexual and hedonists. Like, those things don't apply to Socrates himself, and Aristophanes was using Socrates as a famous figure to sort of like get more attention and be more shocking to forward the point of his play. And I think there's validity to that. Socrates was a renowned ascetic. He, was known for fasting for days, for not, for being able to refuse all sorts of temptation, sexual, materialistic. He was, he did live a very impoverished lifestyle by choice. And he was a war hero, essentially. I mean, he fought in the Peloponnesian War, and he had numerous heroic feats that were well documented and verified by others who were present. So that really undercuts what Aristophanes is saying about Socrates in particular. So he saved the lives of Alcibiades and Xenophon during the war. Obviously, Socrates, his philosophy and his rejection, because what they say is, or what Socrates says, is that the most important thing is to be personally virtuous, right? Is to basically do the right thing. And even though he didn't agree with Athenian society, which he didn't, as a citizen, it was his duty to defend his civilization. And in the moment that you're in, you need to make sure that you're doing the right thing. That's the ultimate good, right? So he was very principled. Maybe we would say he was virtuous, but we could definitely say he was highly principled and highly disciplined. And that does go against, when we get into the good logic, bad logic portion of this, that very much goes against what Aristophanes was painting him as, right? Because he was not depraved. He was highly disciplined. Now, but the things he was saying were actually quite subversive, right? So on Aristophanes' side, he was against democracy, which we can debate the benefits or negatives of democracy. I'm not totally sold on it myself, frankly, to put it lightly. But he was against the way that the society was governed at the time. He was very critical of the masses and of the elites. He was embarrassing the elites publicly during a time of war. And as far as the ironically, or maybe not, it might just be fitting, the people he saved, Alcibiades and Xenophon, both went on to be famous traitors to Athens. And so he saved their lives during the war. They both became his students, and then they both became great traitors to Athens. Alcibiades most famously, and Xenophon literally joined the Spartans. So is that just an unlucky coincidence? I mean, if these are two of his more prominent students, the ones he saved in the war, and they became traitors, we can judge a tree by its fruits. Like, maybe there was something to this idea that Socrates was sowing treachery, and maybe you say, oh, he was right, though, because he was brilliant. And yeah, he was. But if you are a steward, if you have ownership in Athenian society, and your job is to defend it, and you're at war, yeah, he's brilliant, he's this great philosopher, but you might want to kill that guy, So this was enlightening to me. We're always getting woken up to new things. I still respect Socrates immensely, and I still love his work and Plato, which we're going to go through in detail later in the project. But I never really questioned the other side. I always kind of took this like new age sort of modern stance. Maybe it's not too modern because people have loved Plato and Socrates forever, but I kind of always took this like conventional stance that, oh, he was standing up against the man and he got cut down, but fight on, we'll fight on in your name, sort of thing. But now that I'm older and more conservative, and I see the peril that we're in, maybe he was a problem, But that was very interesting, and we could debate that. And I'm not saying that's 100%, but really made me think, and it was the read was worth it just for that and the laughs. And that brings me to my next topic, which is Aristophanes the Conservative. So I said about the birds that the end of the birds gave me these atheistic undertones, that he was like saying that the gods are subservient to man. But I don't think that was right. Maybe it did, but the clouds, like the birds is more out there. The clouds, I think, really shows his feelings, because this is his message to Athens. This is him, like, this is like in many ways like one of his big theses, where he's like explaining how he feels to Athens and trying to maybe advise the Athenian society in what he sees as the right direction. So we actually can get a lot of insight into Aristophanes and what his thoughts were by reading this. At least that's what I kind of get from it. And we see a very conservative man. We see a man who loves his nation. We see a man who, he basically, one of the most evil things that he paints Socrates as doing is being an atheist, is going against the gods, is saying the gods aren't real. And in the place of the gods, he worships the clouds. And I think the clouds are likely a metaphor for the air, or for nothing, or for the intellect or the self, right? Something like that. Because it's like this ephemeral sort of airy thing that he's worshiping. And so, he was someone who he wanted to preserve society. He saw, as many of us do, he saw the foundations of his society to be good. They were there for a good reason. He loved his nation, and so the things that could allow such a beautiful flower to bloom must have been fertile, right? The grounds that allow such a beautiful flower to bloom must be fertile and must be right. And I mean, I believe that too, It's ironic because it's kind of like we talked about with the birds with utopianism. It's like they wanted, they had such big problems with the Athenian democracy and the bureaucracy and sort of the way things were run, but okay, now it's destroyed, the Peloponnesian War is over, and what's it replaced with? It's replaced with despotism. And are any of us going to say that was better? I don't think so. The people didn't seem happy about it. It's not remembered well. So it's like we do need to be careful not to be too radical, especially in the cases like that, like ancient Athens or Western civilization, where we see this enormous product, this enormous fruit that's born by it. Sometimes we can get ahead of ourselves and want to change things because we want things to be even better, but that rarely works. So, and I think Aristophanes really felt that way. He seemed like a defender of sort of, like we have this deep sort of sense of loyalty, right? Conservatism is about loyalty. So it's like, you feel loyal to your ancestors, you feel loyal. It's almost like the people of the past are whispering to you, or the way I always feel like is, I think about like when I was a kid in school and the old teachers that I had and the priests and the, whoever it was. I think about the people who were there and I think about them talking to me, and they're dead now. And I think about the people who taught them, right? Like they were really sort of just reverberating, and they were sort of parroting, or they were furthering a message that was given to them from the generation prior, who were doing the same back and back and back. And it's like this game of telephone. And it's like they're trying to, and now I see how complex the world is, and I see how complex my worldview is as I've gotten older. And it's like that transmission has to be preserved in as much of a way as as much as possible. It's like I am the last, me personally, I'm really the last in this line. Like there was all these people depending on me to further these traditions, to further this transmission of information that goes all the way back for thousands of years. And if I turn my back on it, it's going to be dead. And all those people will be forgotten. I mean, it's a heavy way of thinking, but I feel that intuition. And I think that in some ways that is the core of what like the conservative mindset is. I'm not talking politically like Republican, Democrat. I mean a person who is dispositionally conservative. But enough about that. Next, we talk about the good logic versus bad logic. So this was the agon, the debate between the two opposing sides. where you have the good logic and the bad logic. And our main character, the son, he has to decide whether he's going to follow the way of the good logic or the bad logic. And the good logic represents Aristophanes' conservative ideal of virtue, which is like self-sacrificing, chaste, disciplined, loving and respecting your nation, loving and respecting your family, loving and respecting the gods, right? And just having self-control. It reminded me almost of like and I think the Greeks, it was interesting. I guess they had this kind of concept too. It's like the old Western or the American archetype of the strong silent type. I imagine like John Wayne, and this is what the good logic is representing. It's like this man, and he's very good and he's very strong, and he doesn't say much, but when he does, it's going to hit you, and you better not cross him, sort of like that. That's what it felt like, but like in a very honorable way, in a very honorable, virtuous way. And good logic goes off on this sort of speech, and then bad logic goes, and then bad logic basically says that a life where you don't have these vices and this hedonistic pleasure that like the one the good logic is describing, is not worth living. So he's saying, he's like just the ultimate hedonist. He's basically saying if you can't have this base pleasure, then life is not worth living. And he goes off and he basically, so like good logic is saying that, and maybe he goes too far, maybe not, but he's basically saying that going to the market and being chatty, I think is what he's implying, and gossiping, that's bad, that pampering yourself too much at the bathhouse is bad. And bad logic is saying those things are good, and that, they can help you basically to move forward in society. And he goes on, and good logic, he's against sexual immorality and homosexuality especially. And then bad logic says homosexuality is great, and this is obviously Aristophanes making a dig at Athenian society and immorality. He says, bad logic's argument for why homosexuality is good is that all of the top poets, lawyers, and politicians in Athens all have sprung bums, is the word he uses to describe it, which was very funny. Obviously, that's not a very good argument. So they go back and forth about that. And in the end, our character's son, he chooses the bad logic to his own peril. But what does this mean? Well, this is a fight that happens within each of us. Like for those of us who are trying to live a moral life and resist temptation and be good Christians, be good people, and not, it's all about resisting temptation. It's all about, maybe it's about other things too. Maybe that's just what I'm stuck on. Like Dante has his 7 deadly sins, and they say that lust and gluttony are actually very low, weak sins. But I think especially in our modern world where, so much of that stimulation is instantaneous in our hands all the time. We can order any food we want. Pornography is a huge blight on our society. And just all sorts of, a sexual identity being like at the core of every person's identity, basically. And, just having all of this information available to young people to be able to go down any different branch of perversion before their minds even developed. We're in we are in a time where those lower sins are very prominent. I'm sure they always have been, but I think especially today. And I'm in total agreement with Aristophanes, obviously, as any good person should be, that being disciplined, that being brave, being noble, being stoic, not gossiping, um, not being overly sexualized, not being obsessed with pleasuring yourself with any sort of stimuli, that this is the right way to be. And the closer we get to that ideal, and the irony, as I said before, is that Socrates was like a perfect avatar of this. But the more, and I'm not perfect, but the more it's like these distractions, these stimulating distractions, they are like noise in the background. And the more that you tamp down on those things, the more that you're able to control yourself and exercise discipline over your base desires. It's like turning down the noise, and then you start to be able to notice things. Like your mind becomes more acute to notice subtle patterns, and you start to be able to think in different ways. And I'm excited. I mean, and every time I control another vice, every time I check off another thing like that I have under control that I didn't before, I'm excited, and I say, wow, I can't wait to understand the new insights and to have the new perspective that I will get from this, basically. I wrote in the essay, and I'll say it here, I said, the pleasure of virtue is like a light gently shining from within your chest, softly radiating out through your body. It tolls from inside you and pulses out in white waves that ring. Oh, sorry. It tolls from inside you and pulses out in white waves like rings of sunlight over an open meadow on a quiet morning. The pleasure of vice, by contrast, is more like a flood of ecstasy, convulsing through your body uncontrollably, wriggling through your torso, neck, and limbs, hypnotizing you like a rhythmic voodoo beat, dragging your appendages about while you protest mousily, but quietly succumb with an internal smirk. And that's how it is for me. It's almost like I kind of imagined for the good, for the virtue, pleasure. It's like Aragorn, like sitting at the edge of his tent, drinking like a cup of coffee in the morning, and just kind of like having like this pleasant, like pure sort of, and then like you can feel the white rings of pure pleasure like spreading out over the field. And I think we all know what the ecstatic vice pleasure feels like, so we don't have to get into that. And it's a battle that we all experience every day, although our vices are different. And that brings me to my next theme, Athens and the ruination of vice. So what I'll basically say about this is that, so he has the parabasis in this, and the whole, like half the parabasis is him chastising Athens about that they don't like his plays enough, basically, and we're going to get to that in the next theme. But on the other half, and then he kind of, in the other half of it, and then there are other sort of hints at this throughout the play, he chastises them for their immorality. So the immorality, it doesn't only apply to the Sophists and Socrates, it applies to Athens as a whole. So he talks about the moonlight and how the moonlight is a blessing, and that it allows the Athenians to be able to do work at night once a month without having to pay for lamp oil. But basically they just use that light to do sexually depraved things and have orgies or whatever. And he doesn't say this explicitly because probably it would be too harsh for the people to be able to tolerate. But I think that he blames the Athenian people and their sexual depravity and their immorality for losing the war. I think that is kind of the implication. It's like our main character, he's a normal guy, he gets tied up with these philosophers, and then ends up being his ruination. And then he's saying to the Athenian people, like, if you give up on your noble ways, your historical, traditional ways, and you follow these sophists, it'll lead to your ruination as well. That's kind of the implication. And then now that was all my positives for Aristophanes. Now we'll kind of criticize him a little bit. Aristophanes the Luddite is the next theme. So we've gone out of our way to empathize with him. But, the truth is that history kind of bears him out as being wrong. Like we said before, history loves Socrates and Plato and looks at them as heroes and the founders of Western civilization, which they kind of are, right? And, Aristophanes, as the biggest critic of Socrates and probably in some ways indirectly leading to his death, he's historically borne out as the villain. Now, we've done a good job of empathizing with him, and I think that he was more right than most people are aware of. This play has I still love Socrates. I still think he's brilliant. This play has totally changed my perspective on him, frankly. But what I will say is that, he wasn't just like a useless intellectual parasite. He's a historical mind, and I can't wait for us to get into the Platonic works, dialogues, etc., and to analyze those, because they really lay bare the foundations of reality. And I've read many of the works before. It's brilliant stuff, and it's inspired our people for thousands of years. It's not just a trick. And we have to be careful. We do want to conserve, and we want to avoid charlatans, and we want to preserve our heritage and our society and respect our elders and the stewards of our civilization. But we don't want to stifle growth and progress either. So we need to walk that line carefully. We need to be on top of, especially in the modern day, when things are changing so rapidly and there's constantly new forms of technology. We need to be on top of that, and we need to be ready to jump on the new thing and master it and then use it for our own purposes. I know that's very like, oh, you're Boromir trying to use the ring, but that is how we have to be. Otherwise, we will be destroyed. So we can't be Luddites. We have to master the new, and we have to subvert it and turn it to our own purposes if we're going to survive in this rapidly progressing age. That might not have been as clear 3,000 years ago or whatever, 2,500 years ago. And the next one, second to last theme, is Aristophanes' vanity. So as I said, this one's not really as important, but the whole first half of the Parabasis is him basically like yelling at his brethren, that his play didn't win last year at the Dionysian festival, but his plays had won before. He was very well celebrated for his time, and I think it just shows his vanity. It shows his need to be in the spotlight. And he was an artist, a historically brilliant artist. And this is a trait common to artists, but it gives us some insight into who he was, inability to share the spotlight, etc. And then finally, tragedy masked as comedy. So because of the nature of comedy, and especially after reading The Birds, I expected our hero to win, basically, to somehow win, and he's totally destroyed. I mean, he ends up being beaten by his son, and he ends up burning down the think shop and presumably killing Socrates and all the philosophers. It's a very tragic ending, and so I think that is fitting. It's fitting for Aristophanes' feelings on the matter, but it's not. It doesn't really qualify it as a comedy. And I think the reason for that is probably this is a message that he really wanted to tell people. But he's a comedian. He's a comedic writer. So this is the what would we say? The medium that he has access to. But he just wrote it. Essentially, it's a tragedy, but he wrote it very funny, and then he ended it as a tragedy, but he sold it as a comedy. So that was very interesting as well. So it's a tragedy masquerading as a comedy. So those are my thoughts on The Clouds. It was great. It was really deep, honestly. It was hilarious, but it was also very deep. There's resounding themes that, you know, have political, religious, and philosophical consequences that are still relevant to us today. And I really enjoyed it. The next work we'll be reading is The Frogs. And make sure that you buy the book using our Amazon affiliate link so that you can make sure you're reading the same version as me. And follow us on the blog so that you can make sure you get the full free content, and we'll be up to date with all of our updates, basically. And follow us on all social media platforms to be updated while I post regularly. So next we'll be reading The Frogs, and I'm really looking forward to that. And I'll see you on the other side.